The video today is to go through some of the examples and questions that appear in your reference book and your worksheet book in regards to rounding decimals. Let's look at the first question. It asks us to round these numbers to the nearest tenth, and if you remember our place value lesson, or if you've got your place value table in front of you, the tenth value is the first number after the decimal point. And so what I've done is I've underlined this, and we call this our rounding place. Now, to be able to know how to round it appropriately, we need to actually look at the numbers after it. We can't just get rid of, for example, the 04 or the 53. And the reason for that is that they could still add value to that number. We need to make sure that we take those into account. So I've underlined my rounding place, our nearest tenth, and then I'm going to box up the number after it. And it's this number that is after the rounding place that tells us how to round. So the first question is 7.904, and we're going to use the rhyme that was in our original video, which is 4 or less, let it rest. 5 or more, raise the score. So with this one, it's 7.904. The 0, so we're looking to the 0 to tell us what we need to do. The 0 is 4 or less, which means we're going to let it rest, which means we're not going to do anything to that 9, and we're just going to write 7.9. And our answer asks, or the question asks us for nearest tenth, which means one decimal place after the decimal point, and that's what our answer has. The next one is 16.953. I'm going to look to the 5 to tell us what we need to do, not the 9, but the 5. It's 5 or more, raise the score. Now, if I raise the score, which is to raise 9 by 1, it actually becomes 10, and I can't write 10 there because it's a higher place value. So what we're going to do is we're going to write the 0 and we're going to carry the 1. So this number, when we round it, is going to be 1, and then 1 plus 6 is 7. I've got a decimal point, and I've now rounded to the nearest tenth. Let's look at the question below, the first question. It says that we need to round it to one decimal place. So what I'm going to do for all of those questions, because it says one decimal place, is underline my rounding place, which is just one place value after the decimal point. And if you remember, we need to look at the number after this decimal place, because that will tell us what we need to do in terms of rounding. So I'm going to box up the numbers after here. So I know I don't need to go through the same process over and over again. I can just do the same step for all of them and make sure I'm doing the right thing. So the first one is 34.738. The 3 is 4 or less, which means I let this rest, so 34.7. The next one is 6, 5 or more. I'm going to raise the score, so that's 11.9. 0.27, the 7. Remember, we're looking at the number after where we're rounding to tell us what to do. It's 5 and more, which means I've got to raise the score. So the answer is 0.3. Next one is 275.855. The 5 is 5 or more. I'm going to raise the score. So it's 275.9. Next question is 34.65. I'm going to look to the 5 because remember it's one decimal place. I want to round it to the 6 here, but I'm going to look to the number after it. So 5 or more, raise the score, so 34.7. Next one's 10.783. So 8 here is 5 or more, so I'm going to raise the score, so it's 10.8. Question 2 asks you to round to the nearest hundredth. So that is our second decimal place after the decimal point. So again, I've underlined all of them in all the questions, so I don't need to go back and have a think of what I need to do. The next step when rounding is we're now going to box up the number after it. So I want you to do that as well. So box up the number after our rounding place, because that's what's going to tell us how to round. So the first one is 16.9034. I'm going to look to the 3. It's 4 or less, which means to let it rest. So I'm just going to write 16.90 because I don't need to add any extra value to that. B, it's 32.9949. I'm going to look to the 4. 4 or less, let it rest. So we're just going to write 32.99. Next question is 19.6389. I'm looking to this 8. It's 5 or more because it's a bigger value than 5, which means I'm going to raise the score on the 3, so it's going to be 19.64. Next one, 2.2963. 6 is 5 or more, raise the score. So my answer, and if you remember, if I'm going to raise the score for the 9, it becomes a 10, and I'm going to carry the 1. So that becomes 2.30. And if I'm just going to do a quick check before I move on, 100th, which means I need 2 decimal places after the decimal point my answer, and I've got that, so it's all good. Question 3, round to the nearest whole number. Okay, so that means my decimal place is this here, okay, because I just want a whole number. I don't want any numbers after the decimal place. So I'm going to look to the numbers after it, so I'm going to box those up because they're going to tell me what I need to do in terms of rounding. So the first question is 23.535. So 5 or more, raise the score. So my answer is 24, and it's a whole number, and that's what our question asks for. The next one there is 105.288. So 2 is 5 or less. I'm just going to let that rest. That's just 105. And again, my answer is a whole number, which is what the question asks me. Now I just want to go through a couple of examples for the worksheet so you know what you need to do. So with this one, what you're going to do is you're going to round the number that is indicated by the question, and then you're going to find the answer in the grid and colour it in. So question 1A, and we're just going to rewrite that here. So 1A is 38.2, and it's asking me to round to the nearest whole number. So that is the 8. And I'm going to look to the number after it to let me know if I need to keep it as it is or to round up. So 38.2, the 2 is 4 or less, so my answer is 38. So I'm going to look for 38 in my grid. I'm going to try and have a look. Here it is, and I'm going to colour that in. Let's try the next one, so 2A. So 2A, 4.94, and the question asks for 1 decimal place. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to look to the number after it, and that is 4 or less, so I'm going to let it rest. So my answer is 4.9. So what I need to do is find 4.9 in my grid, and here it is, and I'm going to colour that in. The next worksheet is where you're going to round each of the questions to the decimal place indicated right next to it. So you can see all of those are 1, this one here is 2, this one here is 1, and so on. So for example, with the first one it says 1 decimal place, so I want to round it to here. I want to then look to the 8 to see what I need to do, so it's 5 or more, which means I'm going to raise the score, so it's 0.5. I'm then going to try and find 0.5 here, and it's right there. So the letter that corresponds to it is E. So you're going to go through and round each of those numbers and then find the letter that corresponds to it. If, for example, you can't find the letter, or the number, to find the correct letter, just check that you've rounded to the correct decimal place or that you've actually rounded correctly, and it's a good way to check your answers. The last worksheet has a question that asks about 2 significant figures. Now this is a challenge question. It's a way to extend yourself. You don't need to do it, it's optional, but I'm going to go through a few examples. When we talk about 2 significant figures, what we mean is 2 numbers that have value within a question, for example. So let's look at A. So A says 92.31. So 9 has value, and so we call that significant, and 2 has value, and we call that significant. So this tells us, so we wanted 2 significant figures, here they are, so this means that I'm rounding to that 2, okay, or the 1's value for this particular question. So as always with rounding, I'm going to look to the number after it to let me know whether I need to raise the score or just let it rest. So 3 here is 4 or less, let it rest. So my answer is 92. And you can see I've got 1 significant figure, 2 significant figures, which is what the question asked for, and the place value is the same. This is 92, this is 92. Okay, let's look at B, 365. So I have one significant figure in the 3 and two significant figures to the 6, which means I'm rounding to the nearest tenth for this particular question. So you can see when we do significant figures, the place value that you're rounding to can change depending on the value of the actual number. So as always, we're going to look to the number after it. So 365. It's 5 or more, raise the score. So that's 37. Now, if I have a quick check, I've got two significant figures, but this number is 365, whereas this is 37. They are totally different values in terms of the whole value of the question. So what I need to do is I need to add a 0. 0 is not significant when it's at the end of a number. It doesn't add any extra value, but it allows us to have the same place value. So the question was 300. My answer is now 300. They're both 100 place values. Let's do one last example. C, 5,839. Significant figure 1, significant figure 2. So this time we are rounding to the nearest hundreds. So again, we're going to look to the number after. It's 4 or less. We're going to let it rest. So that is 58. But remember, it's not 58 because we want to have the same place value. So we want it to be thousands because the question is 5,000. So I'm going to add 2 zeros. That allows us to have two significant figures, but also allows us to have the same place value. So just remember that one, underline the rounding place, look to the number right after it because that's going to tell you what you need to do for rounding. And remember, 5 or more, raise the score. 4 or less, let it rest.